My name is Sophie, and if life were a movie, I'd definitely be the extra standing in the far back of a crowd scene, probably partially obscured by a decorative plant. I have spent the better part of my 26 years mastering the art of being invisible. It's not that I don't have things to say. My head is actually a very loud place, filled with opinions, jokes, and observations. It's just that there is a faulty connection between my brain and my vocal cords. Whenever I'm required to speak to another human being, especially one I don't know intimately, my throat decides to tighten into a knot so complex it would baffle a sailor. I'm the person who will walk 3 miles in the wrong direction just because I'm too embarrassed to ask for directions. I'm the person who stays at a party for FO. You are hours without eating because the buffet table is surrounded by people, and the idea of navigating that social minefield for a mini quiche is more than I can bear. I work as a junior graphic designer at a high-end marketing firm. My office is a cubicle in the quietest corner of the floor, tucked away behind the server room. I love it there. It's my little fortress of solitude. I spend my days surrounded by colors, fonts, and layouts. On my screen, I am bold. I use vibrant magentas and electric blues. I choose typography that demands attention. But once I step away from the glowing pixels and into the fluorescent light of the hallway, I revert to my default setting, beige. I wear oversized sweaters and keep my hair down to act as a natural curtain for my face. I've become so good at fade-in. G into the background that sometimes even the motion sensor lights in the bathroom don't realize I'm there, leaving me sitting in the dark, contemplating my own insignificance. The biggest problem with being a professional shadow is that other people tend to step on you. My colleague, a guy named Marcus, is the human equivalent of a megaphone. He's loud, confident, and has the annoying habit of borrowing my ideas. During our Monday morning brainstorms, I usually sit in the back row, clutching my sketchbook like a life raft. I'll have a brilliant concept sketched out, something subtle and elegant, but when the creative director asks for input, I freeze. My heart starts hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and the words die in my throat. Marcus, sensing my hesitation, will glance over at my notes, lean back in his expensive leather chair, and pitch my exact idea as if he just came up with it. Everyone claps, the director beams, and I just sit there, nodding along, too shy to even clear my throat to protest. It's a slow, agonizing way to live, watching your own creativity get auctioned off because you're too scared to bid on it. Last week, things hit a breaking point. We were assigned a major project for a global environmental nonprofit. This wasn't just another ad campaign for laundry detergent. This was something I actually cared about. I spent all weekend in my apartment, fueled by cold pizza and passion, designing a visual identity that felt alive. I used hand-drawn illustrations and organic textures. I felt like I had finally captured something real. But as the presentation meeting approached on Tuesday, the familiar dread began to pool in my stomach. I knew what would happen. I would sit there, Marcus would take the lead, and I would spend another hour pretending that I didn't exist. I walked into the conference room, my palms damp, feeling like I was walking toward my own execution. Just as I was about to take my usual seat in the corner, I bumped into someone. Literally. I walked right into a tall man carrying a camera bag, causing his lens cap to pop off and roll under the table. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I whispered, my face instantly turning a shade of red that would have been perfect for a sunset-themed ad campaign. I scrambled onto the floor to retrieve the cap, my hair falling over my eyes. When I handed it back to him, he wasn't annoyed. He was smiling. He had these very calm, observant eyes that didn't make me feel like I was under a microscope. "No worries," he said, his voice easy and relaxed. "I'm Jack. I'm the freelance photographer for this project. And you are?" I stared at him, my brain searching for my own name as if it were a lost set of keys. "Sophie," I finally managed to squeak out. He nodded, his gaze lingering on the sketchbook I was holding. "Looking forward to seeing what's in there, Sophie," he said, before moving to the other side of the room. For the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a pause. The meeting was a disaster, at least for my ego. Marcus did exactly what I expected. He saw my mock-ups on the shared drive, tweaked a few colors, and presented the GRI en route's concept as his own. I sat there, my nails digging into the palms of my hands, watching my hard work being praised while I remained a ghost. Every time I opened my mouth to say, actually, I spent 48 hours on those illustrations, my throat locked up. It's a physical sensation, like a heavy iron gate slamming shut. I looked across the room and saw Jack, the photographer. He was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, watching the presentation. He didn't look at Marcus, he was looking at me. He had this puzzled expression, as if he could see the invisible strings connecting me to the designs on the screen. When the meeting ended, Marcus was surrounded by people giving him high fives. I gathered my things as quickly as possible, wanting nothing more than to retreat to safety of my cubicle and cry. I was halfway out the door when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I jumped, nearly dropping my laptop. It was Jack. "Hey, Sophie," he said, keeping his voice low. "That was a great presentation." I looked at the floor, my face burning. "Thanks, but it was Marcus's presentation," I muttered. Jack tilted his head, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. The designs were Marcus's, maybe. But the soul? I've seen Marcus's work before. He doesn't do soul. He does loud. Those illustrations had your handwriting all over them. I didn't know what to say. No one had ever looked that closely at my work or at me. "I'm going to the park to scout some locations for the shoot," Jack continued, ignoring my awkward silence. I could use a second pair of eyes. Someone who understands the visual language of the project. "You want to come?" My internal alarm system went off immediately. A park? Outside? With a person I barely know? Talking? It was a recipe for a panic attack. I have a lot of emails," I lied, my voice trembling. Jack laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "Emails can wait. The light won't. Come on, Sophie. Just an hour. No pressure to talk. We can just look at trees and pretend we're working." I hesitated, but there was something about the way he said no pressure to talk that made the iron gate in my throat loosen just a little bit. I nodded, grabbed my bag, and followed him out of the building. The park was beautiful, bathed in the soft, golden light of late afternoon. Jack walked with a slow, rhythmic pace, stopping every few feet to look through his viewfinder. He didn't pepper me with questions or try to fill the silence with small talk. He just existed, and he allowed me to exist alongside him. I found myself slowly relaxing. I pulled out my sketchbook and started making quick studies of the way the shadows fell across the grass. "See that?" Jack said, pointing to a gnarled oak tree. "Most people just see a tree. But you see the texture of the bark, don't you? You see the way the moss creates a pattern." I looked at him, surprised. "Yes," I whispered. "It looks like old lace." He nodded, as if that was the most natural thing in the world to say. "Exactly. That's what's in your designs." That eye for detail. We spent 2 hours in the park, and I think I said a total of 20 words. But they were the most comfortable. 20 words I've spoken in years. As we walked back toward the office, Jack stopped at a coffee stand. "You want something?" he asked. I looked at the menu, the familiar anxiety of ordering starting to rise. I wanted a caramel macchiato, but black coffee was easier to say. I opened my mouth to say the easy thing, but then I looked at Jack. He was waiting, his expression patient. A caramel macchiato, please," I said, my voice barely audible but clear. He ordered it for me, and as he handed me the cup, his fingers brushed mine. A jolt of electricity, subtle but unmistakable, ran up my arm. "See, Sophie," he whispered. "You can ask for what you want. You just have to decide it's worth the effort." I walked home that night feeling like the beige curtain around my life was starting to fray at the edges, letting in small, unexpected rays of light. The following morning, the office felt different. The air was still thick with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of fluorescent lights, but I felt like I was carrying a small, glowing secret inside my chest. For the first time in years, I didn't immediately put on my noise-canceling headphones to block out the world. I sat at my desk and looked at the sketches I had made in the park with Jack. They were raw and messy, but they had a life in them that my digital renders often lacked. I realized that my shyness hadn't just been silencing my voice, it had been thinning out my art, making it safer and more sterile so that it wouldn't attract too much attention. But Jack had seen the old lace in the bark, and he had seen the owl in my designs. That realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. Marcus, of course, was in high spirits. He spent the first hour of the day leaning against people's cubicles, retelling the story of his brilliant presentation. Every time he laughed, a sharp jab of resentment poked at my ribs. Usually, I would just swallow that resentment until it turned into a dull ache, but today, it felt sharper. I kept thinking about what Jack said, that I had to decide if what I wanted was worth the effort. Was my own work worth defending? Was my identity as an artist worth the heart-pounding terror of speaking up? I opened my design software and began to work on the second phase of the environmental project, but instead of following Marcus's tweaked instructions, I started incorporating the organic textures I'd sketched in the park. I was working in the shadows, as usual, but this time I was building something that felt like me. Around noon, Jack swung by the office. He didn't head for the creative director's office or the break room. He came straight to the server room corner, where I was tucked away. He was wearing a faded denim jacket and carrying a stack of large prints. "Hey, shadow artist," he said, pulling up a rolling chair that usually held a stack of old magazines. "I wanted to show you something." He laid out the prints on my desk. They were the photos from yesterday, but they weren't just standard location scouts. He had captured the exact angles we had discussed, the lace-like moss, the dramatic shadows, the subtle interplay of light and leaf. But the last print made my heart stop. It was a photo of me. I was sitting on the grass, my hair falling over my face, completely absorbed in my sketchbook. I looked peaceful. I didn't look like a girl who was afraid of her own shadow. I looked like someone who belonged exactly where she was. "I didn't know you took that," I whispered, my face heating up. Jack leaned back, his eyes searching mine. "You were too busy being yourself to notice." That's the Sophie I saw in those designs Marcus presented. The one who notices the things everyone else misses. I looked away, unable to handle the intensity of his gaze. "Everyone thinks Marcus is the genius," I said, the words feeling heavy and bitter. Jack let out a short, dry laugh. "Marcus is a salesman, Sophie. Salesmen are great at shouting, but they rarely have anything of substance to say. The project is moving into the final client pitch next Friday. The big boss is flying in. If you let Marcus present this phase, he's going to strip all the honesty out of it just to make it commercially viable. Is that okay with you?" I stared at the photo of myself. In that image, I looked like a person who had something to say. "No," I said, my voice a bit stronger than usual. "It's not okay." Jack nodded, a look of satisfaction crossing his face. "Good. Then we have a week to get you ready. I'm not saying you have to become a public speaker overnight, but you have to own your work. Come with me to the studio tonight after work? I have some ideas on how we can present this visually so the work does most of the talking for you." I hesitated. The studio. After hours. More talking. But then I looked at the Green Roots logo on my screen, the one Marcus had flattened and dulled, and I felt a spark of protective anger. "Okay," I said. "I'll be there." Jack's studio was located in an old industrial building on the edge of the city. It was a massive, open space with high ceilings, exposed brick, and windows that stretched from the floor to the rafters. It smelled of developer chemicals, expensive paper, and something warm, like sandalwood. It was the opposite of my cramped, gray cubicle. Here, there was room to breathe. Jack had a large wooden table covered in photographs and a projector pointed at a blank white wall. "Welcome to the lab," he said, handing me a glass of sparkling water. "Tonight, we're not designers or photographers. We're storytellers. We need to show the client why the soul of this project matters more than the loudness of the marketing." We spent hours working. Jack taught me how to pair his raw, honest photography with my organic designs. We created a visual narrative that flowed like a journey through a forest. It was beautiful, but the closer we got to finishing the presentation, the more my anxiety began to claw at my throat. "Jack," I said, sitting down on a vintage velvet sofa in the corner, "even if the slides are perfect, I still have to stand there. I still have to explain the why. When I'm in that room, under those lights, my brain it turns into white noise. I forget how to be a person." Jack sat down on the floor in front of me, his expression softening. He didn't tell me to just be confident, or imagine everyone in their underwear, the useless advice people usually give to the shy. "Sophie, look at me," he said. I forced myself to meet his eyes. "When you were talking about the moss looking like old lace yesterday, were you afraid?" I thought back to that moment in the park. "No," I admitted. "I was just looking at the moss." Jack snapped his fingers. "Exactly. You weren't thinking about yourself. You were thinking about the subject. When you're in that meeting, don't think about the directors. Don't think about Marcus. Think about the trees. Think about the textures. Think about the message you're trying to protect. You're not defending yourself, Sophie. You're defending the art. You're its guardian. Does that make it easier?" I considered this, being a guardian, and felt much more manageable than being a presenter. It gave me a role, a purpose that was bigger than my own fear. We practiced until midnight. Jack played the role of the skeptical client, and I practiced explaining my design choices. At first, I stumbled over every other word. My voice was a thin, wavering thread. But Jack was patient. He didn't rush me. He let me sit in the silence until I found the right word. "Silence isn't a failure, Sophie," he told me after I'd frozen for a full 30 seconds. "Silence is a tool. It makes people lean in. It makes the next thing you say more important. Use it." By the time I left the studio, I felt exhausted but strangely settled. As Jack walked me to my car, the night air was cool and crisp. He stopped by the driver's side door and looked at me, the streetlights reflecting in his eyes. "You're a lot tougher than you give yourself credit for," he said softly. Before I could respond, he leaned in and kissed me, not a dramatic, movie-style kiss, but something gentle and grounding, a promise of support. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like he had transferred some of his own steady calm into my veins. "See you at the office, guardian," he whispered with a wink. I drove home in a daze, the touch of his lips still tingling on my skin. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of my mind like a dark cloud, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I had an umbrella. I wasn't just a shadow anymore. I was someone worth defending, and I had a story that was worth the noise. The days leading up to the final presentation felt like a slow-motion countdown. Every morning, I woke up with a hollow sensation in my stomach, a familiar mix of dread and anticipation. I would stare at my ceiling and repeat Jack's words, "You are the guardian of the art." It was a powerful mantra, but it was hard to hold on to when I walked into the office and heard Marcus's booming laughter echoing through the hallways. He was already acting as if the promotion was in his pocket, swaggering around with a double espresso in hand, talking about big wins and disruptive branding. To him, this project was a ladder. To me, it was a piece of my soul. I spent my hours at my desk, refining every line and every shade, feeling like I was polishing a diamond in a room full of people who only cared about the glitter. The dynamic between me and Jack had shifted into something deeper, something that felt like a secret sanctuary. We didn't talk much during the day at the office. I was still too shy to be seen socializing with the cool freelance photographer, but we exchanged small, meaningful glances. A nod in the hallway, a quick smile over the coffee machine, a text message late at night that simply said, The light was perfect today. It reminded me of your color palette. These tiny anchors kept me from drifting away into my usual sea of self-doubt. Jack was teaching me that intimacy didn't always require a flood of words. Sometimes it was just about being seen by someone who didn't demand you change who you are. He never asked me to be louder. He just asked me to be present. However, the pressure at work was mounting. Marcus had noticed that I was being difficult. I had started politely declining his suggestions to dull down the organic elements of the design. One afternoon, he cornered me by the printer, his tall frame looming over me in a way that usually made me want to apologize for existing. "Sophie, listen," he said, his tone dripping with a condescending kind of friendliness. "I know you've been spending a lot of time with the photographer, and maybe he's filling your head with all this artistic integrity nonsense. But this is the real world. The big boss doesn't want to see moss and lace. He wants to see something that looks expensive and polished. Just give me the files I asked for, okay? Let's not make this complicated." My heart started that frantic, irregular drumming. My first instinct was T. Oh, nod, say okay, and retreat. That was the safe path. That was the path that kept the peace. But then I looked at my hands, stained with the ink of the sketches I'd been working on, and I thought about the kiss in the studio. I thought about the way Jack looked at me when I was just being myself. I took a breath, feeling the air catch in my tight throat. "No, Marcus," I said. It was barely more than a whisper, but it felt like a shout in the quiet of the printer room. Marcus blinked, his smile faltering. "Excuse me." I cleared my throat, my voice trembling, but holding its ground. "I think the client needs to see the original vision. It's what makes the project unique. I'm going to keep my designs as they are." Marcus stared at me for a long beat, his eyes narrowing. "Fine," he snapped, his voice cold. "But when this blows up in your face, don't expect me to catch you." He stormed off, and I stood there, shaking, feeling like I had just survived a lightning strike. That night, I met Jack at a quiet little diner on the outskirts of the town. It was the kind of place with red vinyl booths and a jukebox that played songs from 40 years ago. I told him about the encounter with Marcus, my hands still fidgeting with a paper napkin. I was so scared, Jack, I admitted, looking down at my chocolate milkshake. I felt like I was going to pass out. Jack reached across the table and took my hand, his thumb tracing circles over my knuckles. "But you didn't," he said firmly. "You spoke your truth. That's the hardest part, Sophie. Once you start standing up for yourself, the world starts to adjust to your volume, instead of you always adjusting to the world's noise." We sat there for a long time, the neon sign of the diner flickering outside, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a shadow. I felt like a person who was finally coming into focus. The day before the presentation was a blur of nervous energy. The entire office was in a state of high alert. The big boss, a man named Mr. Sterling, who is known for his sharp tongue and even sharper business sense, was arriving the next morning. Marcus was frantic, double-checking his talking points and making sure his suit was perfectly pressed. I, on the other hand, felt a strange, cold calm. I had spent the last week preparing a separate presentation deck, the one I had built with Jack. It was a risk. A mass. Eve, potentially career-ending risk. If I presented it and Mr. Sterling hated it, I'd be fired. But if I let Marcus present his watered-down version, I'd be losing something much more important than a job. I'd be losing my integrity. Jack came by my cubicle late in the afternoon. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes from spending all night in the darkroom, but he looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated belief. He didn't say, "Good luck." Instead, he handed me a small, smooth stone he'd found in the park. "It's a piece of quartz," he said. "It's been through a lot of pressure to become this clear. Just like you. Keep it in your pocket tomorrow. When you feel like you're losing your voice, just touch the stone and remember the lace in the bark." I tucked the stone into my cardigan, feeling its weight, a physical reminder that I wasn't alone in this. We stood there for a moment in the quiet corner of the office, the hum of the servers providing a low-frequency soundtrack to our shared silence. It was a silence full of things we hadn't said yet, but both understood. That evening, I went home and did something I never do. I stood in front of my full-length mirror, and I didn't look for things to hide. I didn't pull my hair over my face or slouch my shoulders. I stood tall. I looked at the girl in the mirror, the girl who had survived Marcus's bullying, the girl who had found beauty in a gnarled tree, and the girl who had fallen in love with a man who truly saw her. I practiced my opening lines, not as a script, but as a conversation. We're not just Sully. Inga Brand, I whispered to my reflection. We're inviting people to reconnect with the world. My voice sounded different, deeper, steadier. It was still my voice, but the faulty connection seemed to be mending itself. Sleep was impossible. I spent the night staring at the shadows on my wall, watching them shift and change as the cars passed by outside. I thought about all the times I had let people walk over me. I thought about the group projects in college where I did all the work and others took the credit. I thought about the promotions I'd been passed over for because I was too quiet. I realized that my shyness wasn't just a personality trait, it was a wall I had built to protect myself from the pain of being judged. But the wall had become a prison. Jack hadn't broken down the wall. He had simply shown me where the door was and offered to hold it open while I walked through. The morning arrived with a pale, gray light. I dressed carefully in a soft, charcoal gray suit, professional, but still me. I put the quartz stone in my pocket and headed to the office. The conference room was already being prepared. The long mahogany table was polished to a mirror finish, and the air smelled of expensive cologne and anxiety. Marcus was already there, pacing like a caged tiger. Mr. Sterling arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, a man who looked exactly like his reputation, cold, efficient, and entirely unimpressed. As we all took our seats, I felt the familiar spike of panic. My throat started to tighten. My palms began to sweat. I reached into my pocket and gripped the stone. It's cool. Hard surface grounded me. I looked across the room and saw Jack standing by the back wall with his camera. He caught my eye and gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Guardian, he mouthed. I took a deep breath, the iron gate in my throat creaking open just a fraction. It was time. The air in the conference room was so thick with tension you could almost feel it vibrating against your skin. Mr. Sterling sat at the head of the table like a king on a throne of mahogany and expensive leather. He didn't say a word. He just opened a sleek silver laptop and looked at us with eyes that seemed to calculate the profit margin of every person in the room. Marcus stood up first. He was in full performance mode, his voice booming as he began the presentation. He used all the buzzwords disruption, energy, global impact, high-velocity branding. As he spoke, the slides he had prepared, the ones he had stripped of all my hand-drawn textures and organic colors, flashed on the screen. They looked like every other corporate ad you've ever seen, clean, cold, and utterly forgettable. I watched Mr. Sterling's face. He wasn't nodding. He wasn't smiling. He was tapping a platinum pen against the table, a rhythmic sound that felt like a ticking time bomb. Marcus was sweating now, his confidence beginning to fray at the edges. He started talking faster, trying to fill the silence with more noise, more empty promises. As you can see, Mr. Sterling, we've leaned into a premium, minimalist aesthetic that speaks to the elite consumer, Marcus said, his voice hitting a slightly desperate pitch. Mr. St. Willing finally stopped tapping his pen. He looked at the screen, then at Marcus. It's sterile, Sterling said, his voice like a sheet of ice cracking. It looks like a bank. This is an environmental nonprofit, Marcus. Where is the life? Where is the connection to the earth? The room went deathly quiet. Marcus looked like he'd been slapped. He stammered, his eyes darting toward me, looking for a lifeline or someone to blame. Well, Sophie here was responsible for the initial creative direction, and we felt that, before he could finish throwing me under the bus, I felt my hand tighten around the quartz stone in my pocket. The guardian inside me woke up. I didn't wait for permission. I didn't wait for the fear to disappear, because I knew it never would. I simply stood up. My chair scrap. Ed against the floor, a loud sound in the silence. Every head in the room turned toward me. I felt the heat rising in my face, the familiar prickle of a blush, but I kept my eyes on the back wall, where Jack was standing. He wasn't smiling. He was just watching me with a steady, unwavering intensity. "Actually, Mr. Sterling," I said. My voice was small, but it didn't shake. "The version you're seeing isn't the complete vision. We have another direction, one that focuses on the raw, imperfect beauty of the world we're trying to save." I walked to the front of the room, my legs feeling heavy but certain. I swapped the presentation drive with the one Jack and I had built. As the first slide appeared on the screen, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Instead of cold, flat graphics, air was a high-definition photograph of the gnarled oak tree from the park, paired with my hand-drawn illustrations that mimicked the texture of the bark. It looked alive. It looked real. It looked like something worth protecting. I didn't use buzzwords. I didn't talk about synergy. I talked about the moss that looked like old lace. I talked about the way light breaks through a canopy of leaves. I talked about how shyness, and the quiet observation that comes with it, allows us to see the details that the rest of the world ignores. For the first time in my life, I wasn't performing a role. I was telling the truth. I spoke for 15 minutes, and for those 15 minutes, the iron gate in my throat remained wide open. I didn't look at Marcus, who was staring at me in pure shock. I looked at Mr. Sterling, who had stopped tapping his pen and was leaning forward, his eyes fixed on the screen. When I finally finished and the last slide faded to black, the silence that followed wasn't cold. It was thoughtful. Mr. Sterling stayed silent for what felt like an eternity. He looked at the empty screen, then at me, then down at his notes. The silence was so intense I could hear the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of a siren outside. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could see my chest moving. I felt the adrenaline beginning to ebb, leaving me feeling exposed and vulnerable. The guardian had done her job, and now the shy girl was left standing under the bright lights, waiting for the verdict. Marcus looked like he was about to burst. He opened his mouth to say something, likely an apology for my unprofessional interruption, but Sterling held up a single finger, silencing him instantly. "That," Sterling said, his voice low and deliberate, "is the first honest piece of work I've seen in this building in 3 years." He stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked over to me. He was much taller than I expected, a mountain of a man in a pinstriped suit. He looked at me with a sharp, piercing gaze that seemed to search my very soul. "You noticed the moss, Sophie. You noticed the texture. Most designers are too busy looking at their own egos to see the world. You actually looked." He turned to the creative director, who was sitting frozen in his chair. "This is the direction we're taking. I want this young woman to lead the Creati VA team for the entire campaign. And Marcus? You'll be assisting her with the logistics. Since you're so good at shouting, you can handle the media buys." The room erupted into a flurry of activity as Sterling walked out, followed by his assistants. The creative director rushed over to congratulate me, and even Marcus had to offer a stiff, humiliated handshake. I felt like I was in a dream. My legs finally gave way, and I had to sit back down in my chair. The big boss had seen me. Not the shadow, but the artist. I had fought the battle and won, not by becoming someone else, but by leaning into the very things that made me different. I looked toward the back of the room, but Jack was gone. He had slipped out during the chaos, leaving me to navigate the aftermath on my own. I spent the next 3 hours in a whirlwind of meetings and phone calls. Everyone wanted a piece of the new Sophie. It was exhausting, and by the time 5 p.m. rolled around, my social battery was completely drained. I just wanted to go home and sit in the dark for a week. But as I was gathering my things, I found a small, yellow post-it note stuck to the side of my monitor. It had a drawing of a small bird sitting on a high branch, and underneath, in Jack's messy handwriting, it said, "The light at the studio is going to be perfect at sunset. Bring your sketchbook. Guardian's night off. Jay." A wave of warmth washed over me, a feeling of safety that had nothing to do with career success or corporate approval. I drove to the studio, the city lights beginning to flicker to life around me. The fear was still there. It's always there, a quiet passenger in my mind, but it no longer had its hands on the steering wheel. I realized that being shy didn't mean being weak. It meant having a different kind of strength, one that was built on observation, empathy, and the courage to speak when it truly mattered. I climbed the stairs to the studio, my heart light. When I opened the door, the space was filled with the orange and purple glow of the setting sun. Jack was sitting on the velvet sofa, 2 glasses of wine on the table and a blank canvas set up by the window. He looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that makes the rest of the world feel like background noise. "So," he said softly, "how does it feel to be seen?" I walked over to him, sat down, and for the first time, I didn't look at the floor. I looked him right in the eyes. "It feels," I whispered, "like I finally found the right words." The weeks following the big presentation were unlike anything I had ever experienced in my 26 years. The server room corner was gone. I had been moved to a bright, airy office with actual windows that looked out over the city. But the real change wasn't the office or the fancy new title. It was the way the world felt. It was as if a heavy, gray veil had been lifted, and for the first time, I could see the colors clearly. My shyness hadn't disappeared. It's a part of my DNA, after all, but it was no longer a cage. It was more like a quiet room I could choose to stay in or step out of whenever I felt ready. People at the office treated me differently. They didn't shout over me anymore. They waited for me to speak, realizing that when the quiet girl finally opened her mouth, she usually had something worth hearing. The campaign for the environmental nonprofit was a massive success. My green roots designs were everywhere, on billboards, in magazines, and all over social media. But the best part was seeing the hand-drawn textures and the old lace, moss-preserved in every single piece of media. It was a victory for the quiet observers of the world. Even Marcus had changed, albeit slowly. He was still loud, and he still loved his double espressos, but he had developed a begrudging respect for me. He realized that while he could sell a story, I was the one who could create it. One afternoon, he even brought me a coffee, a caramel macchiato, exactly how I liked it and did. And say a single buzzword. He just nodded and went back to his desk. It was his version of an apology, and for me, it was enough. My relationship with Jack continued to grow in the quiet spaces between the chaos. He remained my anchor, the one person who never demanded I be anything other than exactly who I was. We spent our weekends traveling to nearby coastal towns, scouting for locations and exploring old libraries. I found myself talking more, sharing my thoughts and fears with a freedom I'd never known. But we still cherished our silence. We learned that 2 people can be perfectly intimate without saying a word, just by sharing the same view or holding hands while the sun sets. Jack taught me that love isn't about finding someone who fixes you, it's about finding someone who looks at your broken pieces and sees a beautiful mosaic. He still called me guardian, a title I wore with more pride than any corporate promotion. One evening, about 6 months after the project ended, we were sitting on the roof of his studio building. The city was a sprawling carpet of twinkling lights below us, and the air was cool and smelled of rain. I pulled out my sketchbook, the same one I had clutched like a life raft during that first meeting, and showed Jack a new drawing. It wasn't a tree or a texture this time. It was a portrait of him, captured in a moment of quiet reflection. He looked at it for a long time, then looked at me, his eyes full of a warmth that made my heart ache in the best way possible. "You've found your voice, Sophie," he whispered. I leaned my head on his shoe, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "No," I said softly, my voice clear and certain in the dark. "I didn't find a new voice. I just finally learned how to trust the one I already had." I often think back to that girl who used to sit in the dark in the office bathroom, hoping the motion sensors wouldn't forget her. I feel a lot of compassion for her now. She wasn't weak. She was just overwhelmed by a world that values volume over value. I want to tell her that it gets better. I want to tell her that her silence is a superpower, not a defect. Now, as I lead my own creative team, I make sure to look for the Sophies in the room. I look for the ones sitting in the back row, the ones with the brilliant sketches tucked away in hidden folders, the ones whose voices tremble when they speak. I create a space where they don't have to shout to be seen. I've realized that my career isn't just about designing beautiful things, it's about being a bridge for those who are still waiting to cross over from the shadows. Last week, I was invited to give a talk at a local design college. The old Sophie would have fainted at the mere suggestion. The new Sophie was still nervous. My hands were shaking as I adjusted the microphone, but I didn't let the fear stop me. I stood on that stage, looking out at a sea of young, eager faces, and I told them my story. I told them about the old lace and the quartz stone I still keep in my pocket. I told them that the world needs their quietness, their observation, and their honesty. When I finished, a young woman came up to me. She was wearing an oversized sweater and her hair was pulled over her face, just like mine used to be. She didn't say anything at first. She just handed me a small drawing of a leaf. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't think anyone like me could do what you do." I looked at her and saw myself. I took her hand and gave her a small, steady smile. "You can," I told her. "You just have to decide that your story is worth the effort." As I walked out of the college and into the crisp autumn air, I saw Jack waiting for me by his car. He didn't need to ask how it went. He could see it in the way I walked. We drove home together, the radio playing softly, the city passing by in a blur of light and shadow. I realized then that life isn't a destination you reach, it's a constant process of becoming. I will always be shy, I will always love the quiet, and I will always feel a little bit like a ghost in a crowded room. But now, I'm a ghost who knows how to haunt the world with beauty. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the man I love and the distant hum of the world outside, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. I am Sophie. I am a designer. I am a guardian. And I am no longer afraid of the silence. My head is still a very loud place, but now I've learned how to turn that noise into something that matters. I closed my eyes, the quartz stone cool on my nightstand, and drifted into a dreamless, peaceful sleep. The girl in the back of the crowd scene had finally stepped into the light, and she found that the view was absolutely breathtaking. The end of. My story isn't about being loud, it's about being heard. And finally, for the first time in my life, I am exactly where I'm supposed to be.